Good morning, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you very much for joining this webinar. It is the first one for us anyway at the Regional Cooperation Centre that we're hosting this year on LNG. So we're very glad to hear your interest and see your interest in joining us. For those of you who I haven't met, my name is Suan Tan. I'm the head of the IEA Regional Cooperation Centre, which was established here in Singapore about a year ago. And our mission really is to work in partnership with Southeast Asian governments as they advance their energy plans and ambitions. So today we have an exciting lineup of our experts and from our team in Paris who will share a little bit more about the LNG market. Before we get to that, let me just deal with some housekeeping. Please do add your questions into the Q&A box, which is at the bottom of the screen. We will get to those and have about 15 minutes for questions at the end of this session. So please do add them as they come up during the presentation. We will also open the floor to any of those of you brave enough to come off mic and come on the screen. We will also be doing a poll, which I think should have popped up for most of you already during the session. So again, we would appreciate your feedback on that. Philippe Rose, who's also from the Regional Cooperation Centre, will kindly be moderating the questions, so he'll deal with that at the end. But for now, let me please introduce Dennis Hasling, who is our Division Head of Gas, Coal and the Power Market Division. And Dennis will then kick us off and then also introduce the other two members of his team on the call. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks a lot, Søren, and let me take over from here. Good afternoon, colleagues, and good morning from our headquarters here in Paris. We have, I think, a very interesting, very lively lineup today with good topics. We'll be presenting the Gas 2025 report. This is part of our quarterly gas market reports. It was published end of October. It's available on our website, and it covers a broad range of developments for gas and LNG markets. It covers the recent developments, the outlook to 2030, so a 5-year outlook, but also topics like CCUS and low emission gases. It's available on our website for free, but you'll see the highlights today in this presentation. Now, why is this topic in particular important for Southeast Asia? As you'll hear in a few minutes from the colleagues, we see a big wave of LNG coming to the global gas market, and that is going to change a number of aspects. On the positive side, it will bring more affordability and more security to gas and global energy markets, and that's obvious when you're on the buying side. That is a very beneficial development. At the same time, this wave is, the way it looks like now at least, time limited. So we see the wave coming until 2030 in the coming 5 years, but after that, the market might tighten again. And that means that it's also important for the countries in the region in Southeast Asia to think about the strategic choices that they have to make. As domestic production of gas is likely to decline, as demand for gas is likely to go up, including for coal to gas switching, there is a need to invest in a smart way in gas infrastructure, but also take into account the longer term perspective, including of the overall energy mix and decarbonization objectives of their government. That's not an easy one, but that makes it interesting and relevant, and we're very happy to present that to you and discuss it with you here today. I have two excellent colleagues who are joining me and who will do the bulk of the work next to Philippe, who will also present. Gregor Molnar, who is the lead author of our gas market report, including the Gas 2025 report, and Akos Dosh, who is our lead gas analyst, including for the gas modeling. I will hand over, I think, now to Gregor, please.
Dear Søren, dear Dennis, many thanks for your kind words of introduction, and many thanks for the IEA's Regional Cooperation Centre to host today's webinar. It is indeed a pleasure to be here today. So good afternoon, good morning, colleagues. Please allow me to share my screen, and we will start our presentation in a minute. As mentioned, I'm joined today by two excellent colleagues, Ákos Loss, our lead gas analyst, and also Philippe Rose, senior energy analyst at the IEA Regional Cooperation Center. And today's presentation will be very much structured along the lines of our Gas 2025 report. So in the first part of our presentation, we will discuss the recent gas market developments to see where we stand in terms of global gas and LNG markets. Then in the second part, we will look at the medium-term outlook. We will start first with the coming LNG wave, and then we will go into the details around the demand outlook, which will be presented by Ákos, including with a special focus on Asia and Southeast Asia. Then we will have a special section related to CCUS applications along LNG value chains, which will be presented by Philippe. And then last but not least, we will also discuss some of the prospects to low emission gases. So one way to take the pulse of the market is to look at the prices. And on this slide, we are showing the evolution of Asian spot LNG and European hub prices since the start of 2024. The dark blue line indicates TTF at the European benchmark. The light blue line is Platts JKM, which is a key marker for Northeast Asia. And the gray area between the two is the spread. I would like to make three comments related to the recent evolution of gas prices. The first is when we are looking at the first half of 2025, we see that both TTF and JKM were trading well above last year levels. TTF was up by 40% and JKM by around 30%. And this has been very much due to the tighter supply fundamentals, but also geopolitical tensions added more price volatility and provided some upward pressure on gas prices, especially during the Middle East crisis. But when we are looking at the price evolution since the third quarter of the year, we see that a market easing is underway. Today, both TTF and JKM are trading well below their last year levels. And this is very much due to the quite strong increase in LNG supply, which was up by 9% year on year since July of this year. And of course, this is providing some downward pressure to LNG import prices, both in Asia and Europe. The third aspect on which I would like to draw your attention on is the spread between Asian and European hub prices. JKM was trading at almost $1 per MMBTU premium compared to TTF in 2024. And of course, this incentivized stronger LNG flows towards the Asian markets. Now, when we are looking at 2025, we see that the spread practically disappeared. And on a netback basis, the European market was actually more attractive for many suppliers, including the United States. And this, of course, incentivized a very strong inflow of LNG towards the European market. And we will discuss this in just a couple of minutes. On this slide, we are giving a closer look to the supply side. And what we show here is that the increase in LNG supplies have been indeed quite strong over the first three quarters of 2025, rising by more than 5% compared to the previous year. And as we can see on this chart, this has been very much supported by North America, including the Plaquemines LNG facility in Louisiana, but also the recent startup of LNG Canada. In addition to that, we see that Power of Siberia is being ramped up to its contractual capacity and is delivering more natural gas, more piped gas to the Chinese market from Russia. Now, all of that growth has been partly offset by the lower pipe gas deliveries from Russia and Norway to Europe. The Russian flows declined due to the halt of the transit via Ukraine starting from January 2025. Meanwhile, in Norway, we had more maintenance this year, which reduced the pipe gas flows to the other European countries. In addition to that, EU storage injections have been particularly strong over the summer season, up by 35% year-on-year over the April to October period. And of course, this further tightened up market fundamentals. And these tighter market fundamentals are also reflected in the slowdown of global gas demand growth. On this slide, we are presenting the year-on-year change in natural gas consumption across the key regions we are very closely monitoring in our quarterly gas reports. And this includes, of course, Asia, Europe, North America, Eurasia, as well as Central and South America. And what is quite visible here is that after a rather strong increase of almost 3% in 2024, natural gas demand growth across these regions slowed down to just around 0.5% in the first 3 quarters of 2025. And it is also visible that this growth has been actually concentrated in Europe, where demand increased by around 5%. And this has been mainly due to a combination of weather factors, including colder winter in Q1, but also lower renewable power output due to the slower wind speeds and reduced hydro availability. In contrast, our estimates indicate that natural gas demand in Asia remains subdued and actually slightly declined. And that has been partly driven by the weaker macroeconomics, relatively high spot LNG prices, and also a rather mild Q1 in Northeast China. In our view, this is a temporary slowdown, and we expect that global gas demand growth will return to a faster pace already in 2026. Now, of course, China has been a very important driving force behind these trends. China's LNG imports declined by 17% year-on-year in the first 3 quarters of 2025, which is the sharpest decline since the 2022 gas crisis. And on this chart, we are presenting some of the key contributing factors to that decline. Demand in China has been flattish over the first 3 quarters of the year, which is in sharp contrast with the strong 6% growth we have seen in 2024. In addition, as already mentioned, Russia's pipe gas deliveries to China via the Power of Siberia pipeline are ramping up and added around 6 BCM of supply to the Chinese market over the first 3 quarters of the year. In addition to that, China's domestic production has been rather strong this year, up by 6%. And when we combine all these factors, we see that LNG is in a way squeezed out from China's primary gas supply mix. We estimate that Chinese buyers nominated downward their long-term contracts by around 10%. But what is also quite visible is that the procurements from the spot market declined by a staggering 33%. And of course, this left more LNG to other markets, including to Europe, where we see, in a way, an opposite trend this year. As mentioned, Europe's natural gas demand increased by around 5%. In addition to that, we have seen stronger storage injections, up by 35%. And in addition to that picture, we have seen lower pipe gas deliveries from Russia, from Norway, but also from certain other sources, including Azerbaijan. Now, in this context, Europe's LNG imports surged by more than 25% to an all-time high of 127 BCM. And this has been indeed critical for Europe to fill up its storage levels to an adequate level and to prepare for the 25-26 winter season. And also I would like to highlight here the very significant role played by the flexible US LNG, which accounted for most of the incremental LNG supplies to the European market. Now with that, allow me to turn to our medium-term outlook. And I think that really the starting point for us is the LNG wave, which has been mentioned by Dennis at the beginning, and which is actually unfolding as we speak. By the end of the decade, we expect that global LNG liquefaction capacity will increase by around 300 BCM per year. And this unprecedented wave of LNG supply is very much supported by the United States and Qatar, which together would account for 70% of the incremental LNG liquefaction capacity. I also would like to highlight that more than 220 BCM of LNG liquefaction capacity reached FID after Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine. And of course, the consequent reduction of Russia's pipe gas deliveries to the European market. So this strong increase in LNG liquefaction capacity will be critical to rebalance the global gas market, to enhance energy supply security, and to improve the affordability of natural gas, including for price-sensitive markets, including in Southeast Asia. Now, one of the central questions we had when developing our medium-term outlook is what will happen with all this LNG? On this slide, we are trying to give a response to that question. The first bar indicates the incremental LNG liquefaction capacity, which is the 300 BCM already mentioned. But we also need to apply some derating factors to that, which includes assumptions on the ramp-up rates, the utilization factors, and we also included some assumptions on the reduction of LNG output from legacy producers which are facing feed gas supply issues. And this includes major producers in North Africa, but also in Southeast Asia. And when we apply these derating factors, we see that global LNG supply would increase by around 250 BCM by the end of the decade. What will happen with demand? Now, this is, of course, a critical question. And in our base case, which is in a way static and which relies on the prices as they are informed by the current forward curve, we see that global inland LNG demand would increase by around 170 BCM by 2030, and Asia would alone account for 2/3 of that growth. In addition to that, we also see a strong increase in LNG demand coming from the maritime sector. And this is partly due to the expansion of the LNG carrier fleet, but also supported by the growing interest of commercial fleet operators in using LNG as an alternative fuel. Still, when we combine these two demand growth factors, we see that by the end of 2030, we could have a LNG surplus of around 65 BCM. And this leads us to our more dynamic high case, in which we assume that Asian and European LNG prices would start to gradually converge towards the short-run marginal cost of US LNG starting from 2027. And these lower prices could indeed foster stronger natural gas demand and LNG import requirements, and rebalance the market. Very importantly, we estimate that 80% of this incremental demand would come from the Asian markets, which would play a key role in absorbing the LNG wave and also could benefit from this lower LNG price environment. And with that, I would like to give the floor to my colleague, Ákos Losz, who will guide us through the demand side with a special focus on the Asian markets. Ákos, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Gergely. Once again, my name is Ákos Losz, and I'm the lead gas analyst at the Gas, Coal and Power Markets division of the IEA. And I'm also greatly honored to be here with you today to present our findings to our local stakeholders in Southeast Asia. Now that Gergely has covered our medium-term outlook for LNG supply, let's move on to the demand side and let's see what our forecasting framework, this base and high case, means for global gas demand in general. As you can see on this first graph, our base case projection leads to an overall demand growth of around 9% between 2024 and 2030. And this is equal to about 380 BCM of additional demand in absolute terms. In the high case, which is on the lower bar, where we have lower prices and higher demand, global gas consumption can increase by almost 11% or by 450 BCM in absolute terms. And these projections actually translate to an average annual growth rate of about 1.5 and 1.7% in the base and the high case. And both of these rates are slightly higher than what we had in the previous 6 years, when we had an average growth of only about 1.4%. So we not only expect continuing growth for global gas demand, but also a little bit of acceleration of the growth in the next 6 years compared to the last 6 years. Now, this should come maybe not as a big surprise if we consider the fact that we had both the COVID crisis and the global energy crisis during this last 6-year period, and both of these events had a very negative effect on global gas demand in general. But regardless of which case we are actually looking at, Asia will be the main driver of global gas demand growth in the medium term. We expect it to account for about half of the global growth in both cases, and China alone is projected to account for about a quarter of the global increase. The second largest contributor, as you can see in both cases, is the Middle East, where gas demand growth is mostly driven by large-scale oil to gas switching in the power generation sector, especially in Saudi Arabia. But some part of this growth is also coming from the energy-intensive sectors of industries in the Middle East. North America is also a big contributing factor to this growth, and this is mostly driven by higher gas use in the power sector, where we see a lot of AI and data center driven demand, but also the energy sector, which includes both upstream operations, which we expect to grow, and also fuel use for LNG liquefaction operations, which is a big part of this next LNG wave. Other regions like Central and South America, Eurasia, and Africa are expected to see much less growth. And in Europe, we actually expect gas demand to decline in both projections. And this is mainly due to the declining demand in the power sector, where renewables are growing very rapidly, and that is squeezing out gas in the electricity mix. So if you can have the next slide, please. So from a sectoral perspective, industry is the most important driver of growth at the global level. If you combine industry and energy on use, which we sometimes do, energy on use includes refining and also oil and gas operations and LNG plant operations, as I already mentioned. Then the combined share of this energy plus industry sector is around 45% of total demand growth in both cases. Power sector is the second biggest growth driver. It is responsible for around 35% of the net increase in both cases. And once again, Asia is a dominant driver here, but the Middle East is also an important player. When it comes to power, we estimate that about 50 BCM of the incremental growth in gas for power demand actually comes from the Middle East alone. It is also interesting to note that the residential and commercial sector contributes relatively little to this overall growth, even though in Europe we sometimes like to think of gas as primarily a heating fuel. But this is actually not the case in those parts of the world where gas demand is still growing, especially in South and Southeast Asia. The last sector is the transport sector, and the transport sector's contribution is not very large in absolute terms. However, it is interesting to note that more than 80% of this growth from transportation is coming from road transport in China and India alone. So if you can go to the next slide, thank you. So Gergely already mentioned the analytical framework that underpins our high case demand projection, where we estimated the additional demand response in LNG importing countries if the spot LNG price drops to a very low level. And for this, we actually did a very detailed regression-based analysis to see where this price responsive demand would most likely come from. And based on this analysis, we have estimated that around 80% of this growth, or roughly of the total growth, is roughly 65 BCM, and about 85% of this growth is actually coming from Asia, as Gergely already mentioned, and more than 80% of it will come from power and industry alone. There is some residual growth happening also in the refining sector and in transport, but power and industry is really the two dominant sectors where this price elastic demand can be expected to come from. If you can move to the next slide, you'll see that we sometimes like to highlight some fun facts or interesting numbers in our reports. And one such fact in our latest report was that in just 4 distinct subsegments in 4 distinct areas, we can see more than 70 BCM of demand added between now and 2030. Just for comparison, this is roughly the size of the Indian gas market in its entirety, or the gas markets of Thailand, Singapore, Vietnam, and the Philippines taken together. One such pocket of demand is as you can see on the first bar, is LNG-fueled trucks in China, which is already a very well-developed market. China already has a fleet of about 1 million LNG trucks on the road today, and we think that this number can more than double by 2030, and this would generate an additional 25 BCM of demand from this one segment alone in China. India's build-out of the city gas distribution sector is also a relatively concentrated source of demand. This includes both residential and commercial users, but even more importantly, small industries and compressed natural gas vehicles. And we do estimate that the total contribution from this sector could be about 8 BCM within our forecast period. The third pocket of demand is the United States, where we see data center driven demand becoming a major source of additional demand growth in the power sector, and this could add about 20 BCM of additional demand by 2030. And finally, we also think that the shipping sector can contribute around 15 BCM from international bunkers, which was also shown on Gergely's chart, and another 3 BCM from shipping can come from domestic shipping, inland waterway vessels between now and 2030 as well. So if you can move to the next slide, we take a closer look at the Asian market, which is still the most important region in our outlook in many ways for gas demand growth. Gergely already noted that Asian gas demand and LNG imports are in a little bit of a slump or a slowdown this year, but we expect this slowdown to be only temporary. And by 2030, we do expect that almost 200 BCM of additional demand can come from Asia in the base case, and nearly 250 BCM can come from Asia in the high case. As we already mentioned, this is roughly half of the total growth in global gas demand in both cases. And because LNG is the main supply source for Asia to meet any additional demand, a significant part of this growth will, of course, also translate into sharply increasing LNG imports, which you can see on the right-hand chart. Now, we can see very clearly on both graphs that there are three distinct pillars for this region's gas demand and LNG imports growth, and these are China, India, and emerging Asia. Emerging Asia is a sub-region for our analysis, which includes all of the LNG importing countries in South and Southeast Asia. So let me take a closer look at each of these in turn in the next few slides. As for China, we expect it to remain the largest driver of global gas demand growth at the country level. And in our base case, China's gas consumption goes up by nearly 100 BCM, or about 20%. And in the high case, it could go up by as much as 125 BCM, which is roughly a 30% increase. As you can see on the left, most of this growth comes from industry, power, and transportation. And I should also note that the average growth rates that we have for the whole forecast period, which is around 3% in the base case and 4% in the high case, is only about half of the average rate that we saw in the previous 6 years, which was much closer to 8%. Now, if you look at the supply side on the right, we can see that domestic production continues to grow, but its annual rate actually slows down to around 3.5% per year, because we think production is maturing in China, and also because lower prices may have a negative impact on upstream economics on the margins. For pipeline gas imports, we expect some additional growth from Russia through the Far East pipeline, and also from the additional ramp up of Power of Siberia 1. But I would like to emphasize that we do not include Power of Siberia 2 in our forecast for the time being, and we don't think it can come online before 2030 in any case. So the slowdown in domestic production in China, together with the relatively modest increase in pipeline gas exports, creates room for an additional 25 to 50 BCM of LNG demand, as you can see on the blue bars on this right-hand chart. If we can move on to India on the next chart, we can see that Gege mentioned Asia. India is part of it as well. We see some short-term declines this year in both gas consumption and LNG imports, but we do expect Indian demand to start growing again next year. And this is thanks to the continuing build-out of the domestic distribution grid, and also to the growing LNG supply availability that will support additional demand growth over the medium term. So by 2030, we see India's gas consumption to grow by about 40 to 50%, depending on the case, and it could reach between 100 to 107 BCM by the end of the forecast. As you can see on the left, the biggest sectoral driver actually is in industry, which is driven by growing activity levels and also by price responsive demand, especially in the small and manufacturing industries, which often have fuel switching capabilities between gas and LPG or naphtha. On the supply side of the picture on the right, you can see that domestic gas production is expected to peak in India, and by 2030 it could drop below the 24 level again, which was around 35 BCM. And all this means that LNG imports could double by 2030 if India's gas demand really takes off, as we see in our forecast. Now, the last bit of this growth puzzle is, of course, emerging Asia, which is the third major pillar of Asian gas demand growth and LNG imports growth. And we think in the case of emerging Asia, this is supported by strong economic activity, rising overall energy demand, and also the increasingly competitive spot LNG prices, especially in our high case, as Gege already described the assumptions behind that. In our base case, emerging Asia's gas consumption grows by more than 20%, or about 55 BCM between 2024 and 2030. And as you can see on the left, power generation is the main driver of this growth. It accounts for about 60% of the region's gas demand increase. And we expect that most of the remaining growth is actually going to come from industry. On the supply side, on the right, you can see that we expect domestic production in the region to decline by about 6%, or 14 BCM. And again, this combination of growing demand and shrinking production will transform the region from a small net LNG exporter to a significant net LNG importer by 2030. Now, if you drill down a little bit deeper into country level dynamics, in volume terms, this means that emerging Asia's LNG imports could rise from around 55 BCM in 2024 to somewhere between 120 and 130 BCM by 2030. Now, as you can see on the right part of this chart, at the regional level, the problem is that the region only has about a little more than 100 BCM of free gas capacity at the moment, and not all of it is in the right places. So import capacity is clearly a bottleneck. If you look at the specific LNG importers within the ASEAN region by country on the right-hand side, you can see that this problem is quite widespread, and LNG import capacity will be a key bottleneck almost everywhere in the Southeast Asia region. So there is definitely a very strong potential for growing LNG imports, and we think that a long period of low spot LNG prices can actually trigger even more demand in this particular region, which is quite price sensitive. But the region's ability to unlock its full demand potential will very much depend on its ability to develop more LNG and also downstream gas infrastructure within the next 5 years, which, if you follow the region's history, it has not always been very easy in some of these countries to build additional LNG and power projects. Now we can return to these questions during the Q&A, but let me stop here and turn it over to Philip Rose, our senior analyst in Singapore, to take us through our findings related to CCUS applications in the LNG sector. Philip, over to you.
Thank you. Let's go to the first slide. And indeed, our Gas 2025 report includes a snapshot of developments on CCUS as applied to LNG value chain. So if you can bring the content onto the start slide, thank you. So I'll start with a quick overview of where emissions occur in the LNG value chain and where CCUS can make the biggest difference. So even though LNG is often seen as a lower carbon alternative to coal, it still has a sizable greenhouse gas footprint. And so while overall most of the emissions are on the combustion side in the power plants, emissions at the supply chain level come from two parts of the value chain, from the upstream gas production side and also the liquefaction at the LNG plant. And generally, the upstream element is where the largest share occurs. So this includes CO2 that naturally occurs in the raw gas and must be removed before the gas can be processed. And historically, that CO2 was vented, but CCS changes that. It allows producers to re-inject the separated CO2 back underground. And it's one of the few scalable and relatively low-cost options that we have today to cut process emissions. And there are some strong demonstrations of this pathway already, like Snøhvit in Norway has been re-injecting CO2 since 2007, and Gorgon in Australia has stored more than 11 million tons of CO2 to date. There's momentum growing here. Qatar's Ras Laffan facility and Indonesia's Tangguh Ubadari project are both integrating CCUS at large scale as part of long-term LNG development plans. And on the upstream, the key message is CCS or CCUS is technically proven, commercially relatively mature, and often the lowest hanging fruit in terms of LNG-related CO2 reductions, especially when combined with methane mitigation and flaring reduction. It can significantly reduce supply chain footprint before LNG reaches the liquefaction stage. If we go to the next slide, moving to the liquefaction stage, so that's the second significant source of emission, because most liquefaction plants burn natural gas to power the refrigeration compressors that bring the LNG down to minus 160 degrees or so. But there are three levers to reduce these emissions. The first one is electrification, actually, using low carbon power. So a recent example of that would be LNG Canada that draws on hydropower, and Freeport LNG in the US that was connected to the grid, allowing on-site CO2 emissions to be reduced by about 90%. Qatar Energy is relying on deploying gigawatt level solar power to supply LNG facilities. So those are some of the examples that show how just switching energy source can dramatically change the carbon profile. The second lever is direct CCUS at the plant itself. And this is just an emerging space. So Venture Global has announced plans to do that and introduce that for its facilities. And Equinor is exploring linking its LNG operations to the Northern Lights storage network, which is taking in CO2 from industrial plants in Europe. So when combined with electrification and efficiency, CCUS can really help deliver LNG with substantially lower upstream and liquefaction emissions. So beyond emissions reduction, there are actually strategic benefits as well. So increasingly, lower carbon LNG is becoming more relevant for buyers in Europe and Japan and Korea. It also supports companies' license to operate. It can potentially increasingly help developers access long-term contracts, possibly financing, and ESG-sensitive markets. There's some infrastructure advantages with LNG developers typically having subsurface project, offshore engineering expertise that are relevant in developing CCS hubs. And in some cases, there's a possibility to also share storage capacity with third-party emitters. But the costs vary widely. So on the feed gas CO2 capture side, costs can range between $20 to $50 per ton. But on the post-combustion capture side, this can exceed $100 a ton. And then if the CO2 has to be transported and storage costs as well, those costs depend heavily on distance. So it really means that policy frameworks, shared infrastructures, and economies of scale will be essential. So to sum up, CCUS is not a silver bullet, but it is increasingly becoming a critical tool for keeping LNG competitive in markets where carbon intensity matters. And especially when combined with methane abatement, electrification, and operational improvement, CCUS can significantly improve the carbon density performance of LNG supply. Thank you. Back to you, Akos.
Thank you so much, Philippe, and thank you, Akos, for these excellent overviews. And now in the last section of this presentation, we will move to the outlook for low emission gases, which is part of our program on low emission gases. So one reason why we are watching closely that space is because we do expect that the supply of low emission gases will expand quite strongly. Over the medium term, we actually expect that their supply will increase by more than 2.5 times by 2030, which would translate into an increment of 20 BCM in absolute terms. And as we can see on this slide, most of that growth will be actually driven by biomethane and low emissions hydrogen. And while this increase is quite significant, I also would like to note that their significance in the total global gas supply mix will remain limited, with low emission gases accounting for roughly 1% of the total global gaseous fuels by the end of the decade. Now, on this slide, we are giving a closer look to biomethane. Global biomethane production increased by an estimated 15% in 2024 and reached just over 10 BCM, with most of the supply concentrated in Europe and North America. We do expect that global biomethane or renewable natural gas production will more than double by 2030. And as we can see on this chart, most of that growth will be coming from Europe and North America, together accounting for 80% of incremental supply. But we also see some strong growth potential in Brazil and India. Now, when we are looking at low emissions hydrogen, we see a long pipeline of projects being proposed, and they could actually translate into 37 million ton per year of low emissions hydrogen supply by the end of the decade. But as we can see on the pie chart here, about 90% of these projects are either in early conceptual stage or are undergoing feasibility studies, and only 11% of the proposed of the projects which are in the pipeline are in a mature phase, meaning that they have either taken a final investment decision or are under construction. And when we take into consideration these mature projects, we expect that the supply of low emissions hydrogen would increase by 5-fold by 2030, and would increase to over 4 million ton by the end of the decade. As we can see on the bar chart, this growth is mainly concentrated in North America, where it would be supported by CCUS, China, where we expect the picture dominated by electrolytic hydrogen, as well as Europe, where the technological split is more diversified, with around 60% of the expected low emission hydrogen coming from electrolyzers, and the remainder would be CCUS based. Now, another potential contributor to low emissions gases is e-methane, which could, of course, contribute to the network integration of low emission gases, and also could enhance the flexibility of the future gas system, but it comes at a relatively high cost. On this map, we are showing a non-exhaustive list of the proposed e-methane products, and we can see that in Europe, Finland is in the driving seat, but globally, Japanese utilities and trading houses are advancing very actively partnerships for the development of e-methane, including with LNG exporting countries such as Australia, the United States, Peru, or more recently, the Emirates. Now, it is important to highlight that none of those projects have reached to date a final investment decision. But if we consider all these projects which have been proposed, the supply of e-methane would be at just around 1 BCM by the end of the decade. We also see that there's a more cooperation needed between suppliers and buyers to unleash the potential of e-methane and to make a contributor to the future of low emission gases supplies. With that, dear colleagues, please allow me to conclude with the key takeaways from the report and from today's presentation. We are in a way transitioning from the tight supply market conditions which emerged after the 2022-23 gas crisis to a more loosened market conditions as the LNG wave is unfolding. We do expect that by 2030, 300 BCM of LNG liquefaction capacity will be added, which will indeed enhance energy supply security and also improve the affordability of natural gas. Global gas demand could increase by around 10% under our high case trajectory. And this will, of course, also supported by the lower prices, which could foster additional gas demand, especially in price-sensitive markets. Very importantly, Asia would alone account for half of the incremental gas demand. When we are looking specifically to Southeast Asia, we see here a case for a strong increase in LNG imports due to the growing gas demand in the region. And this is happening in combination with declining domestic production in some markets. But it will be also critical to address the infrastructure constraints to enable higher imports. As highlighted by Philip, momentum is building behind LNG's plus CCUS applications, which is also a recognition of their crucial role in reducing emissions along gas and LNG supply chains. And last but not least, we see a case for a rapid expansion for low emission gases driven by biomethane and low emissions hydrogen, but still their impact on the global gas balance will remain limited over the forecast period. I also would like to conclude with one final remark. While we are transitioning towards a more loose market, there is no place for complacency. If there is no investments made in the LNG value chain in the coming years, and we have a stronger demand growth, as highlighted by Ákos, we could indeed end up again in a tighter market environment in the 2030s. Moreover, we are living in a more complex, geopolitically more fragmented world, and as such, there is a continued need to keep a close eye on energy and gas supply security and to foster the cooperation between responsible gas and energy producers and consumers. We would like to thank you for your kind attention and looking forward to your comments and questions. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. So we've started receiving quite a few questions, and I'd like to start with grouping a few questions that are related to prices. So at the short run marginal cost of US LNG, will LNG be competitive with coal or renewables? And does the SRMC include the capital and financing costs for the new US LNG capacity? And similarly, at what SRMC of US LNG will Asian and European prices converge downward to unlock additional demand for LNG?
Yes, thank you, Philip. Maybe I can take that question first. I think that I will start by saying that the short-term marginal cost don't include the initial capital investment cost. This really relates to the short-term operating cost of supplying LNG and also procuring the feed gas in those markets where we don't have vertically integrated LNG products. I think that in many markets, domestic coal supply will remain more competitive than LNG, even if the prices fall to the short-term marginal cost. But these lower LNG prices could also stimulate some policies including in Asian markets to promote the use of natural gas, including to curb emissions and also in relation of clean air policies.
Thanks. We have a few questions on Asia demand assumptions. So in our base case, we assume that Asia will soak up the upcoming supply wave from US and Qatar production. But what happens if the Power of Siberia 2 is completed? and Chinese demand is supplied via the new pipeline, could this lead to material impact to spot prices worldwide? And in our 2030 LNG import focus for Malaysia, do we consider the recent influx of data center? So Energy Commission of Malaysia has called for additional CCGT capacity by 2029. And I think a related element is a question about fuel switching flexibility, availability in the Asian power and transport sector to take advantage of this low spot LNG price.
So maybe I can take first crack at this one. For Power Siberia 2, luckily we don't think it's feasible to complete it by 2030, even if construction started today. And as we read the news, that is clearly not the case. There is no firm supply agreement in place. The project is still in the, as I understand, in the feed phase. So Gazprom is working on some design studies currently. So on the 2030 horizon, we certainly are not contemplating the market impact of this project. But of course, if it eventually is completed, then it brings an additional 50 BCM of supply to the market, which, given that it's all going to China, will directly be supplied into the global market, and as such, it will of course loosen the market balance by an equivalent amount. So that would certainly put pressure on prices for a greater extent, and also for much longer. So it would certainly have downstream implications impacting LNG exporters if it happens at all. For flexibility in power and transport, yeah, I mean, we think that a transport sector is actually the most of the flexibility and most of the price sensitivity is concentrated in LNG fuel trucks in China, which we observe historically have been quite sensitive, especially truck sales have been quite sensitive to the local LNG price. So we try to estimate the impact of various price scenarios on that particular segment, where LNG competes directly with diesel fuel, and if the payback period is becoming short enough for operators, then they are happy to switch to LNG fuel. And so that particular bit of the transport segment has been quite price elastic. But CNG fleets in India, for example, where we see the biggest potential growth from the CNG sector, it really depends on the pace of the build out of the local CNG filling infrastructure, which is in a way can be accelerated or decelerated depending on the policy preferences and the attractiveness of international LNG prices. But it fundamentally depends on the pace of the build out, not so much on the actual price level that is prevailing in the market. And these are the two most important markets, India and China, for transport sector growth. So I think the flexibility here is quite limited to Chinese LNG fuel trucks for the moment. And the question about so can you remind me of the third
Data
part of the question? I think
centers,
data centers. So our power forecast was finalized, I believe, at the end of September, early October. So any developments that were announced or that took place before that date have been mostly incorporated. So to the extent there have been additional announcements in Malaysia, which are pertinent to this question. Anything that came after early October have not yet been fully reflected in this forecast. But we do expect quite strong growth from the Malaysian power sector, and part of that I assume is also driven by this trend. So if I recall our numbers, I think we have about 16 BCM of total demand in the high case for Malaysia, and more than half of that is coming from power generation. So quite strong growth already coming in our forecast from Malaysia.
There's a question about whether gas turbine shortages may affect gas demand outlook in the power sector for Asia. And I think it's a question that's worth broadening in general. Like, for example, if Southeast Asia wants to debottleneck regasification capacity in time, is it possible at all, given the supply chain constraints?
Yeah, I mean, this is especially a pressing issue in the US, where by far there is the most such developments for power sector, for AI-driven data centers. Also in China and Europe, these are the leading markets for AI-driven power sector demand. But of course, as we heard, Malaysia has some plans of its own, and we also see some developments in other East Asian markets. But you know, I think we have to differentiate between the various markets. China, of course, has plenty of generating capacity. For example, it never goes above 30% utilization of its gas-fired power fleet, even though it's adding more CCGT units over time. But that is mostly for backup purposes. So if those projects don't happen, then they still can meet additional load growth. India similarly has a large stranded gas-fired fleet, so presumably those are already equipped with the necessary turbines. So there is scope for increasing power sector load factors without ordering new turbines for the plant. And Southeast Asia is, of course, a very diverse region. So in some places, we simply just substitute for pipeline gas imports, like in the case of Singapore. So obviously that will not necessitate a lot of new CCGT capacity, only a substitution of pipeline gas with LNG. Similarly, in the case of Thailand, you know, we substitute for falling domestic production. So the downstream to the extent that is the case remains largely unaffected. But you know, we know that in Vietnam, in the Philippines, for example, most of these proposed LNG projects are integrated LNG to power projects. So obviously there is a power component there which needs new turbines, and so I think the timelines can potentially be impacted by this. I have to say I'm not terribly familiar with the state of the ordering of key equipment pieces for this particular project. So if those turbines have already been ordered, then I'm sure they are in the queue. If not, then there can be a long wait nowadays. Indeed, we have 5+ years for a new gas turbine. So you know, in these more nascent markets where you need both LNG and power projects to happen concurrently, that indeed can be an issue.
I think we could take one or two more questions. One that got upvoted quite a bit is about prices. So how should we think about the interplay between gas and oil prices? Indian demand highly price sensitive, not just in absolute terms, but also as a slope to crude. In our analysis, what's the slope to crude that the scenarios assume for triggering consumption?
Yeah, well, when it comes to India, indeed, in some sectors there is not so much a competition between coal and gas, but gas and oil products. We see that to be the case, of course, in the transport sector where CNG is gaining ground, and you know, the adoption rates and the use of these vehicles to an extent depends on the relative oil and gas prices. We also see that refineries routinely switch between mostly LPG, but other oil products as well, and natural gas, depending on the price levels. So in these recent drops in Indian gas demand, the refining sector was a key component of that. Fertilizer sector has, I understand, been converted from naphtha, so there was an oil to gas switch, but it is not very easy to convert those plants back to naphtha from natural gas. So I think that's not so much a case in the fertilizer sector anymore. And as I mentioned, in these small industries, it is often the case that they have already access to gas from the distribution grid, but also have an LPG tank as a backup. So depending on the price dynamics, they can switch dynamically. So yeah, it is concentrated in a few of these key subsectors of Indian demand, but generally we think that if gas is accessible at this level that Gergely mentioned, the short-term marginal cost of US LNG, then also depends, of course, on the local taxation, which is another big factor in India. Oil and gas are taxed differently, and gas is not yet part of the goods and services tax regime. So that's another factor to consider, the uneven taxation of these various fuels. But generally, we think that LNG at this $5-6 per MMBtu range is highly competitive with all products, and would certainly lead to additional uptake in these sectors where there is switching ability between oil and gas.
And then one question also on whether the failure of the IMO to adopt the net zero framework, which includes LNG as a compliance pathway, does that impact our prediction that the maritime sector will be a key demand sector?
It was not included in our estimation of bunker-related LNG demand, because this happened in mid to late October, if I remember correctly. Our estimates for shipping-related LNG demand have been finalized well before that date, over the summer and around September. So this was certainly not incorporated in that estimate. But as I understand, this is just a 1-year delay for the time being. So I guess until we have more clarity, we hold on and wait with the full consideration of this development when it comes to LNG demand in shipping.
Yes, just one point to add to that our outlook for LNG use in the maritime sector is very much based on the current order book, and of course a very large part of the additional LNG demand growth is coming from the expanding LNG carrier fleet, which with the new types of LNG carriers are heavily relying on LNG from boil off. So I would not think that this change would have a huge impact on our outlook.
And then maybe last question, which is one that comes to me quite a lot, is about how to think about LNG and strategic independence or dependence. So in the popular press, often we hear Europe is trading one strategic dependence for another by moving away from Russian gas to US gas. How can we think about that? And also in Southeast Asia, how can governments take advantage of abundant LNG supply with energy independence as a driver?
Gergely, you wanna have a go at that?
Well, I mean, I think that the question relates to Southeast Asia, but maybe just from a European perspective, I think it is very important to recognize the role played by flexible US LNG during the 2022-23 gas crisis. Without these flexible US LNG supplies, Europe would have been at a very high risk of a full-blown energy crisis, including at a heightened risk of gas supply shortages. So I think that this is the starting point when we discuss US LNG from a European perspective. Then, of course, there is this discussions about the reliance on US LNG, and then some people do compare it to the previous dependence on Russian pipe gas. I think this also needs to be put in a broader context. The Russia accounted for around 40% of Europe's natural gas demand before invading Ukraine. Today, the share of US LNG in meeting the European demand is around 20%. So they are at a different scale. The second maybe difference is that Europe was relying on one state-controlled Russian company. This is certainly not the case when it comes to US LNG, which is supplied by a plentitude of private LNG project developers and portfolio players. And of course, the logistics are very different when we compare piped gas supplies and LNG, which is by nature more flexible. And of course, I think that there is the geopolitical component, which hopefully I don't need to explain in great detail, but certainly they are not comparable. Also not in that respect. So this is just to give a bit of the European perspective on that question. But also maybe just one point which we did not maybe highlighted enough in the presentation is that we also see that the global LNG market is evolving, is transforming. It is becoming more liquid, more tradable. We do expect that flexible LNG contracts will account for more than half of the contracted volumes by the end of the decade. This is up from just 30% back in 2016. They also see a greater pricing diversity emerging. So I think that this growing flexibility and liquidity of the market reduces the risk of being too reliant on one single source of supply. But I would leave to Ákos on the more Southeast specific aspects of that question.
Yeah, I mean, I just can partly repeat what Gergely said. There is a qualitative difference between relying on your ally versus relying on your adversary, and also there is a qualitative difference between relying on a single pipeline supplier and relying on a multitude of suppliers happen to be coming from the same country and not controlled by any government. And we do see US LNG as generally a great benefit for LNG importing countries when it comes to supply security and supply flexibility, and its contributions have been well recognized during the European energy crisis. Of course, the question for Southeast Asia is whether in what form this additional LNG can come into the region, whether based on long-term contracts or more on a spot traded basis, or through intermediaries, including portfolio players, which we also note in the report are becoming a larger part of the LNG supply mix towards the end users. They will account for about 45% of the traded LNG market by 2030, based on the current stack of LNG contracts. So, and some of these markets in South and Southeast Asia have historically been struggling to sign long-term contracts because of the credit quality issues of the off-takers, and I think there has been some improvements, especially in ASEAN economies in that respect. But there is still challenging for some, including in Vietnam and Philippines, where it is apparently not easy to get a firm PPA for the power that would be produced from the LNG, without which it is not too easy to go out to sign a long-term LNG contract without such guaranteed end use demand. So I think these issues persist, and for this reason, it might be that some of this benefit from US LNG will not necessarily come from a formalized, contractual relationship based on long-term contracts, but in the form of spot market purchases and through intermediaries, including portfolio players. But nonetheless, I think the region as a key LNG importing region and also as a growth market for LNG will definitely stand to benefit from this additional wave of LNG supply in general, and particularly the flexible aspects of that wave that is largely due to the fact that about half of this wave is coming from the US alone. So
maybe just add a few words, if I can, in general, just to wrap up what Ákos and Gergely have mentioned. I think the question is about energy security and dependencies. One of the golden rules, as we call it, of energy security is diversification. Gergely mentioned the example of the over-dependency from European perspective on Russian pipeline gas, 40%, more than 40%. That's what you want to avoid. So as a policymaker, what you should keep an eye on is, do you have a diverse portfolio when it comes to importing gas in the form of LNG or pipeline? And then, of course, as Gergely already mentioned, within the US, there's a multitude of different players who can supply LNG. So as long as you have diverse suppliers, I think that is a form of guarantee of security for your supplies. We're thinking a lot about geopolitical events, of course, these days for obvious reasons, but it could also be technical, financial, legal issues. And that's why this diverse portfolio is really important as you depend on the imports for your country or region.
Yep, great. Thank you very much. So back to you, Dennis, if you want to close.
Thanks a lot, Philippe. Thanks for moderating our Q&A. Thank you, Gergely and Ákos, for being so available and so reactive to all the questions. I have to say, I was very impressed by the questions that we got. We do these webinars more regularly. This is the first one we do on gas in Southeast Asia, but we have more webinars. Some are more, let's say, interactive and lively than others. This was a very interactive one. I'm really happy about the high number, but especially about the quality of the questions that we received. It shows the clear interest that there is for gas topics in the region. So from our perspective, we'll be very happy to continue this kind of engagement in the form of webinars or maybe also other events. And we welcome any comments or feedback that you may have. And with that, I will close the session, thanking again Philippe, Gergely, and Ákos for their very useful contributions. Thank you all for participating.